Thanks for joining me on Beyond the Water Cooler. This is where we have the conversations that matter about putting the human factor back into business. Why? Because we know that when we get people right, we get business right. My guests are awesome people who know about all things leadership, engagement, mental well-being and high performance. This is a space to listen, reflect on your own practice and learn how to create an even better experience. I'm your host, Lisa, psychologist and psychotherapist and founder of It's Time for Change. Let's dive in. So today's guest has been introduced to me in somewhat unusual circumstances. His wife and I were huffing and puffing our way through a battle box class at the gym. And then Rachel said to me, told me about her husband, and there seemed to be a few things we had in common. And so here we are. Welcome, Gareth Tennant.
Oh, thank you very much. Thanks for having me on your podcast.
Pleasure. So you are Director of Decision Advantage. Anyone looking at your website will notice that there are lots of references to the sort of armed forces in terms of all the imagery and so on.
Yeah.
Tell us more about how you came to be doing what you're doing. What's keeping you busy in that space about decisions?
Yeah, so I am a former Royal Marines officer, and I did that for about 20 years. And I specialised in intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, which is, an overly complicated way of saying I used to help find what was going on to support decision making, operational planning, and then the execution of operations. And that led me to become really interested in initially sort of technical sensors, things like radars and drones and spy satellites. And I sort of went on this journey where I actually realized that you can find stuff out using technical sensors, but what you do with that information is really important.
Mm.
And it's far more difficult to interpret information than it is to collect it. And so what started as sort of quite a technical passion became a passion for how we make decisions as people and as organisations. So when I left the Royal Marines, I decided that that's what I really wanted to do. And I set up a company, as you said, called Decision Advantage, where I help organisations make sense of not only the vast amount of data and information that we have access to, but also look at how they make decisions within their organizations and the processes that they go through to optimize decision making. And I think that's something that is really, really important to all organizations, no matter what sector you're in, but is often not really thought about that much.
And that's why I'm looking forward to this conversation today about strategy and tactics and all that stuff, because I think it's a space that not many people really give much conscious thought to. And I know more recently, I've been sort of spending more time in this decision-making space, running sessions, just at a much, I guess, less in-depth level than perhaps you're doing it, as part of our leadership labs work. And people go, oh, hadn't you thought about all this stuff to do with decision making, like how we make decisions and why we make them like that? And again, it's one of those things. It's like so many of our behaviours that we just take for granted. We don't actually question how we do them and how we make them better.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the interesting dynamics about the military is most of the time you're either on operations or you're not. And when you're not, you're preparing for and training for operations. And that gives us quite a lot of breathing space to learn by doing, but in a safe to fail environment. And so naturally, a lot of what the military does is we're now kind of talking about in more sort of wider society, psychological safety, this idea of training to failure and training in order to learn where you're good at things, but more importantly, where you're not good at things. And so one of the sort of aspects of that that I try and bring into the commercial world when I talk to organizations is to build space into the program for training.
Mm,
And there's a lot of sort of mandatory training and things that we have to do for compliance. But actually, what I want organizations to look at is taking the time and the space to step back and look at what could happen rather than what is currently happening.
mm,
And I think that's a challenge which we are all sort of up against because we don't have enough time to,
mm,
and time is a precious thing.
mm,
But if you do that, if you take some of your capacity to think about what could happen, you tend to be better prepared, and therefore you're able to make better decisions as and when situations start to change around you.
mm,
And I think that aligns to what you've alluded to in terms of tactics versus strategy, which
mm,
are very military terms, but have obviously crept into our more common lexicon, and we talk about these things all the time, but I don't think we necessarily think about what they are. And we
mm,
use the term tactics and strategy often synonymously,
mm-hmm.
but they're very, very different.
So before we dive into what they actually mean, because I'm really interested to hear what you're going to say in this space, um, just taking a step back, actually, when you were saying about the information, the data that people use to inform decisions, one thing I really liked about your website was the kind of the line on the main on the front page, which is about where data becomes intelligence. And I love this line. There's a lot of information out there for the taking, but some people just know how to join the dots better than others. And I love that. It's really simple because actually, if we're going to think about decision making and think about strategy and all the stuff that we're going to talk about today, it is, as you said just now, about creating space to be able to stop running with our heads down and being task focused and be able to kind of come up a bit for air and look at actually the data that's around there, which is an immense amount that most people just gloss over, even if it's obvious data. Like we've gone out and sought it. It's like, do you use that? Let alone the data that is just there and we're not actively seeking.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the first thing is to recognize that data, information, and then what I call intelligence are three different things. So data is, as you say, it's out there, it's everywhere. And we're not just talking about computer data,
Mm,
digital data. When I talk about data, it's just signatures in the noise. It's just information that is bouncing around. And the way I describe it is data is information without context. So it's
hmm
just out there and it's just noise. Once you start to aggregate it and put it into context, that's when you have information. And information has potential value, but you can have information about all sorts of things. And what you've got to try and do is work out what is relevant.
mm,
And it's only once you start to align having the right information to be able to support your decisions or to influence the way other people make decisions that you're now starting to move into what I call intelligence. And of course, I'm using the military term
mm,
intelligence rather than any kind of cognitive ability.
mm,
Military intelligence is simply information used to support decision making.
mm, Okay, so tell us then what we mean by strategy, what we mean by tactics.
Yeah. So, firstly, it's worth recognizing strategy is a military term and it goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks. And the idea of strategios, which is the art of the general. And the general, of course, is the person that's in charge of the army.
Mm,
And so, without this becoming a massive history lesson, there was a point where armies met on battlefields and went to war, and there were set tactics. And tactics were what soldiers did and the drills and the sort of procedures that they went through in order to fight battles. Strategy was the what the general did in terms of organizing the army to be in a position to use their tactics to the best effect. So effectively, strategy is being able to use your capacity, your capabilities to achieve goals over the long term under conditions of uncertainty. And the uncertainty is really important there
mm,
because if you don't have uncertainty, if you are certain about what is going to happen, then you don't need a strategy. What you need is a Gantt chart and a
Mm.
plan. Um, and so strategy is about being adaptive to a changing environment, being able to make assumptions, be able to learn as you go to optimize the use of your capabilities, whether that's people, time, money, resources, whatever. Whereas tactics is using your capabilities in the here and now to achieve tasks.
Mm.
And in the military, we link these two things together with what we call operational art. So if you have tactics as sort of your overarching, these are the goals you want to achieve, and tactics is the application of capability to achieve tasks, then the linking of those two things together is the operational art. And that's the ability to create organizations, teams that cohere together, often when they're physically disparate, often when communications is difficult, but are still able to achieve a collective endeavor.
Brilliantly put. And I really like that. I like when you're describing the strategy around the emphasis on uncertainty, because so many people um, feel really uncomfortable about uncertainty and change. And it's like, it's not, doesn't, we've got this plan, it doesn't fit. And how do we respond? And it leaves people flailing. And there are so many people and organizations who are constantly kind of running after themselves, after the tails, trying to work out what to do because something unexpected has happened, because they are basing their plans on what they think is going to happen rather than predicting for the unpredictable, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. And I recognize that completely. I think part of that is because yeah, as humans, we we like certainty. We are uncomfortable with ambiguity. We're uncomfortable with uncertainty. And that's part of our sort of evolved
Yeah.
way of surviving. But we have to recognize there is uncertainty and there is ambiguity. And particularly when you're operating in conditions that are changing, the business environment is always changing, then you have to recognize that you're going to be on the edge of your comfort zone.
Mm,
And if you're constantly trying to get back to that feeling of comfort where everything's under control and you know what you're doing,
mm,
then you're either going to end up being very, very good at something that becomes quickly irrelevant, or you're going to continually be bouncing between feeling very comfortable and calm and then feeling out of control.
mm,
And I think what I'm trying to do with the leaders and the managers that I work with is to try and get them to a point where they can find balance and comfort with the fact that there is uncertainty ahead of them. There
mm,
are decisions they're going to have to make that ultimately they're not going to have all the information to be able to make those decisions. Some of those decisions are going to be probably wrong in hindsight. But if they're
mm,
prepared for that and they recognize that and they build teams that accept that, then you can build learning organizations. And
mm,
then very quickly, whilst there is stuff happening around you that you're still not quite sure of,
mm.
you feel like you're heading in the right direction and everything starts to become a lot more comfortable.
Yeah. So I guess it's about embracing that uncertainty. Like just, or I mean, I'm someone who, I was talking to someone earlier who loves team days, like away days and challenges and stuff that you don't know what challenges are going to be, what the outcome is, but you kind of get stuck into it. And it's that kind of excitement. If people have that in a work context, the day to day, it's like, oh, that feels too far out of my comfort zone. And I think, as you say, trying to create an environment where actually we make the most of that uncertainty because we know if we can lean into that and we are equipped to deal with that and to think about that. And I guess embrace it in terms of trying new things because we have to evolve. So we're going to have to try something different, knowing it might not work, but it might work. And And actually, that's when you get real innovation and people can get quite excited about learning together and failing together. And it comes back to that psychological safety that you mentioned earlier.
Absolutely. And people are often quite surprised when I bring these lessons from the military, because I think there's a sort of view, and it's a relatively naive view of the military being very procedural.
Mm,
There are drills, there's lots of discipline, there's very strict hierarchies and rank structures. And of course all of that is true,
yeah.
but that's in order for us to be able to very, very quickly manage everything that is certain
Mm,
so that we can concentrate on the management of uncertainty. And one of the things that I really enjoyed about being a small team commander in the Royal Marines was, once you get the what we call standard operating procedures, the drills based stuff out
mm,
of the way, once that becomes muscle memory and everybody knows how to use their kit and equipment and knows what the voice procedure on the radio is, or yeah, th that all becomes second nature.
mm,
And then you're all concentrating on making sense of the complete uncertainty and often chaos of an operational theatre.
mm,
And and one of the sort of characteristics of conflict is it's chaotic and uncertain. And in fact, you have an adversary that is often trying to increase that uncertainty. And if you've got teams that absolutely embrace that and are looking for opportunities, then you create innovation and creativity. And that's where you get advantage.
mm,
And that's why my company is called Decision Advantage, because
mm,
it's about creating teams that not only know where to find the information, but also know how to use that information better than their
mm.
competitors.
Yeah, I like that that term of standard operating procedures in terms of applying that to or companies like workplaces because I spend a huge amount of my time, and actually I'm spending running several workshops tomorrow on just reducing stress and creating mental space to
Yeah.
be able to think about the stuff beyond what's immediately in front of us. And so many people are so consumed by running around like it's almost like being a hamster wheel, just kind of trying to get on top of their to-do list, which feels very, that's the immediate need that
Yeah.
people aren't able, they don't feel in control of their standard operating procedures. So they never create that space to take a step back and look at the bigger picture, how we can do things differently, or to think about what could be changing in the future and how we'd respond to that.
Yeah. And I think part of that is when you're in that space of everything feels slightly out of control and I don't have enough time to review the small things, then you don't evolve. And so one of the things, and I go back to what I said earlier about the military often finds itself having the space to practice things when they're not on operations. And that gives us the ability to evolve and adapt our standard operating procedures. So although these things are, in theory, that these are the fixed elements of the way that we organize ourselves and the way that we make decisions, in reality, it's a constantly evolving process. And
Mm,
we're constantly checking and asking questions. And there's a concept that we talk about, which is the idea of loyal dissent. So one of the perceptions of the military is that there's this very strict hierarchy and everybody knows who's in charge because we all literally wear rank, on our shoulders or on our chest. But the reality is that all that rank signifies is who the leader is, who the commander is, and it it might signify something about an experience level and previous jobs that they've done. But ultimately, it's the person who has the accountability and the responsibility and the authority. But it doesn't mean that they have the monopoly on ideas. It doesn't
mm,
mean that they're the only person who gets to make decisions. What it means is that they're the person who ultimately controls the flow of ideas.
mm,
And we have this concept, which is really, really important. And it's something that I bring into my consultancy work, which is this idea that we call mission command. And it's really, really simple, but hugely valuable in creating all of the things we've talked about. You know, comfortable in ambiguous and uncertain conditions. It
Mm,
creates psychological safety, and it allows teams that don't have particularly solid communication to be able to still work towards a common goal. And it's a really simple thing. It boils down to you don't tell people what to do, you tell people what you want them to achieve, and you let them work out what they need to do in order to achieve that. And it sounds really simple, and it is really simple, but it's quite difficult to do because it needs the right culture to enable it, and it also requires trust. And so I think it's quite common now that I go into organizations and they recognize the need for flat structures. They
mm,
recognize the need for psychological safety. The step that they miss is recognizing that you can't just create it through some sort of edict. You can't just say, right, we're now gonna have psychological safety. Everybody's now safe to make decisions. You have to build trust,
mm,
and mutual trust is one of the foundational parts of mission command. So the second thing is you have to, as a leader, and that it doesn't matter whether you're the CEO or whether you're a shift manager or everybody is a leader to a greater or lesser extent, but everybody as a leader has to recognize that they may have accountability and authority, but they need to delegate that whilst retaining responsibility, which
mm,
basically leaves you in a position where you allow people to go and make decisions, and ultimately the results of those decisions are going to fall on you. And that's a really uncomfortable position to be in,
mm,
and therefore it's really difficult to do. But
mm.
it is ultimately how we get organizations to be effective and working in environments that are dynamic and uncertain.
Yeah, and it reminds me of a director I worked with when I was working with some teams of leaders in the NHS a couple of years ago, where one of them was giving that permission. He was making very clear, go and make whatever decisions you think you need to make based on, what you know and what the data you're seeking. Um, make good decisions and I'll have your back. So even if stuff goes wrong, I'll have your back.
Yeah.
And what he achieved in his team compared to some other teams who felt that they had to run everything through their manager, it was like poles apart. And people knew that people had, their leaders had their back and they felt
Yeah.
trusted. And it's such a you obviously have to demonstrate it, but it's such a simple way, it's a straightforward way to actually building that trust quite quickly. It takes a lot for the manager to to make sure they are backing whatever happens and to kind of demonstrate that in practice. But it's so powerful.
Really is. And, the data speaks for itself.
Mm,
And you can read, there's a multitude of management and leadership books out there that espouse, psychological safety,
mm,
empowerment. Yeah, everybody knows that this is what's the right thing to do. The difficulty is in actually creating the cultures that allow us to do it. And one of my favorite academics, because I'm a bit of an anorak around these things, in organizational culture is Edgar Schein. And he talks about organizational culture and leadership being two sides of the same coin.
hmm
And I think that's a really important analogy because we talk about leadership a lot. We don't necessarily talk about organizational culture. Or if we do, we're having two separate conversations. So we'll
mm,
talk about leadership one day and we'll talk about an inclusive culture the next day. And the reality is these two things go together.
yeah.
And they go together because an organization is driven by the behaviors of the people in it, particularly the behaviors of the leaders.
Mm,
And the culture also normalizes behaviors. And so leaders behave in a particular way because of the culture they're in. So these two things are symbiotic. And in order to grow and develop, we have to learn, and in order to learn, we have to have new information, and to have new information, we need to be exposed to new things. So there's two ways of doing that. You can experiment, you can try new things, and you can fail fast and fail forward, and there's lots of
Mm,
cliches around doing that. But effectively, you're trying stuff out, and then as long as you have feedback loops and you are learning from that, then you can take that forward and get better.
yeah.
The other way of doing it is to go out into the environment and seek new information. And that's exactly what I did in the Royal Marines, doing reconnaissance and surveillance.
Mm,
Is going out, putting people at risk, using capability and capacity, not to go and engage and kill the enemy, but to go and watch the enemy, to learn, to then make better decisions about how you're going to engage and kill the enemy. And that reads across really nicely into the commercial space because we can start to then put time and effort into finding out about our operating environment, about the market conditions, about the competitor, about the customers that we want to service. Not necessarily to drive up sales, but just to find out more about the way that we operate. And then we can start to talk about what we might want to do if
mm,
things change. We can experiment, we can practice new ways of doing things, and you can create these conditions where people have good ideas because of mission command, because you've told them what they're trying to achieve. They can situate those ideas within the strategic goals of the organization. And sometimes they won't work,
mm,
but people will feel empowered to go and try these things out. And if it doesn't work,
mm.
then as long as you've got those feedback loops and as long as you've got that mutual trust that if things don't work, as long as it
Yeah.
wasn't malign, as long as it wasn't negligent, then that's fine. You
Yeah.
know, then we've moved forward. And one of my favourite quotes is from a guy called General Stan McChrystal, who you may have heard of. He's relatively well known. He was one of the most senior US operational commanders during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. And he talks about within his teams, he never punishes mistakes. He will always punish negligence.
Mm,
And I think that's so important. And if you separate those two things out, things going wrong doesn't necessarily mean somebody did something wrong.
yeah.
Negligence, we need to stamp that out. We need to change those behaviors. Experimentation, learning from doing, yeah, we should embrace that.
Massively. I'm a massive fan of experimentation. That's the whole sort of backdrop foundation of Leadership Labs, which is about go and find things to experiment on and close that feedback loop. And I also like, what you've been describing is, I think, will give permission to a lot of leaders to not have all the answers. Because I work with so many people who are, I could say, older, so that I guess they've been in leadership roles for a while, and I'm still being told by so many of them, um, I feel anxious about not knowing what's happening next. I feel anxious about not having all the answers, or I feel worried about I've got people around me who are now cleverer than I am at doing these individual tasks or having this knowledge and skills and so on. And they're worrying about and questioning their role as a leader. And I think it's challenging for some people about what is a leader. And I think how you've described that is brilliant in terms of the kind of the command bit and the control bit, which is not about having all the answers and dictating everything, but it's about creating a space where everyone can show up and engage and share their knowledge and their experience and their ideas. And it's a very collaborative process that everyone's part of. And I think when you can almost see when you explain it to people, you can almost see their shoulders just relax a little bit. It's like, phew, because it's a big shift for a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, it's something that you can read about and there are thousands of books on leadership. There are even more on management. And but learning by having experience
Mm,
is far more important. And in the military, we define. You'll notice that the military has this tendency to define things, which is why I quite like
Mm,
saying, right, well, there's a definition for this and there's a difference. But we define command, leadership, and management as three different things. So I think management is perhaps the easiest to understand, and management is just about the allocation of resources, and that can be time, money, people, things in a warehouse, doesn't really matter. You divide them up and you allocate them to tasks, to projects. That's management.
hmm
Management is a science. It's something that can be learned. It's something that can be practiced. It's something that can be trained for. But ultimately, it's about organization. And you
mm,
can be good at it, and there are people who are naturally good at it, or you can be terrible at it and learn by, experience. I'm not brilliant at management. I just don't have the right kind of brain or attention to detail. But I'm aware of that, and
yeah,
that's okay.
yeah.
Leadership is about getting people to do things. And there are thousands of definitions out there, but ultimately it's about getting people to do things. Sometimes things that they might not want to do,
hmm
sometimes things that are in my world particularly, things that are dangerous, things that are high risk, things that are very, very uncomfortable. But it's about getting people to do things. So it's about relationships.
mm,
And that's something that you really have to do by experience rather than by reading it in a book
yeah.
because it's about relationships. And again, there are people who are naturally better, more empathetic, better at reading people, perhaps more Machiavellian. I don't know. Um, and then there are people who aren't natural leaders but have learnt to be good leaders.
Mm,
And then there's command, and command is the glue that knits these two things together because command is about the allocation of authority, responsibility, and accountability across an organization. So when we talk about empowerment, empowerment requires somebody to have command and then to deliberately and explicitly say, I am empowering you to make these kind of decisions, to use these resources, to have the authority to sign off on, I don't know, this amount of money or whatever it is. But it has to be something that is clearly defined and explicit, because otherwise, what you end up with is ambiguity within your own decision-making processes. And if you talk about empowering people to make decisions, but then don't tell them what the limits of those decisions are or what the consequences of those decisions are, then you're not really empowering them. You're
mm,
just sloping shoulders and shirking responsibility. So if you tell people explicitly that you want them to be able to make certain decisions, and there are limits, and these are the limits. So you can make decisions about money up to a certain budget, or this is your team of people, and I want you to use them as you see fit and grow them and develop them. But here is your team. Then it becomes really explicit. But with that, also then comes a responsibility for training those people to have that accountability, that authority, and that responsibility. What you can't do is just tell somebody they're now responsible for a whole load of money when they've never done budgeting. And then, when it all goes wrong, blame them. So there's a whole lot of work that goes behind these really simple ideas.
mm,
And ultimately, and I've said this already, the thing that has to be in place is mutual trust. And you build mutual trust through experience, through getting things wrong together, through learning together. And if you're sensible about it, and none of this is, rocket science, you will give people the authority to make decisions based on the level of experience and training and trust that you have. And you'll grow that over time. So these are not things that can be just done overnight. And
mm,
this is why it comes back to my point about culture. Because you have to grow a culture. You can't build a culture. You
yeah.
cultivate it, the clue's in the name. So it's a bit like growing a garden. You can, put the flowers in the right part of the garden to get the
Mm,
right sunlight. You can water them, but ultimately the garden grows on its own, and you just set the conditions. You can't build it.
yeah.
You have to develop it and grow it.
Yeah. I like that. I think it's also interesting about the like kind of empowering people, and with that comes responsibility for training and development, because that's a bit I see missing a lot. So people are put into roles, they're given roles and responsibilities and told they've got to fulfill these amazing outcomes, but they're not given any development. They and of course those people end up floundering and feeling very anxious and perhaps knowing that they're not fulfilling their role in the way that is expected of them. And it's not good for their self-esteem, and it's not good for the results of, the impact on performance of their teams. And it's a really big gap. And I think again, because that training and development is often around, you know, some of it's around soft skills, around emotional intelligence. It's around the stuff that's not, here's a new IT program, you need to learn how to engage with that, or here's a new piece of equipment, we're going to train you how to do that. And of course, that comes as being really obvious, but
Yeah.
it's the stuff behind the scenes that you can't necessarily see. It's not so tangible that people miss time and time again.
Yeah, absolutely. And this comes on to another subject which we could talk for an hour about, which is a sort of hobby horse of mine, which is measurement and measurement
Mm,
of effectiveness. So there's a cliched term, but it's very true, which is the things that can get measured get done.
yeah.
And quite often we talk about developing our people, we talk about creating psychological safety, empowering people to make better decisions, working better as an organization. And then we report on them based on really hard metrics like turnover or sales and all that does is it undermines all of those really important soft skills that you've mentioned
Mm,
because people are then focused on, well, the things I'm getting reported on are, how many sales I make. And it's not just how many sales I make, it's that figure in comparison to everybody else. So
mm,
now it's a competition.
mm,
And what you create there is bad or incentives for bad behaviors
mm,
where people want to undermine each other, undercut each other, not share information, not develop other people in their teams because they're in competition with them. And so I was working with an organization recently, and they were talking all of the right things were being said around where their problems were and how they wanted to develop. Up until the point where I started to say, well, you need to start rewarding people and reporting on people based on the progress they're making towards creating this culture. And that starts with the senior leadership of the organization.
yeah.
So when we talk about you don't punish mistakes, but you punish negligence, the first thing we need to do is start recognizing that not changing and not creating the incentives to change is negligence, because that is effectively calcifying or reinforcing the calcification of this organization that wasn't managing to adapt to a changing operating environment. And that's when people start to get really uncomfortable
Mm,
because people who are in senior positions of leadership and management are often there because they're good at what they do,
yeah,
and
exactly.
you're asking them to do something different.
Yeah. Yes, and without knowing how. And I think it's
Yeah,
a lot of people, it's that fear, isn't it, that I'm suddenly going to be shown up to be incompetent and to not know. And also fear of what I might uncover if we start asking questions, and I'm not kind of trying to dictate everything, but I'm empowering other people and actually seeking their voice.
yeah,
What am I going to hear? What are we going to uncover? And a lot of people don't want to take the lid off.
yeah, absolutely. And bringing this back to sort of lessons from the military,
Mm,
we we talk about operational effects. So what effect do we want to have on the enemy? What effect do we want to have on the situation? And that can be really blunt. It could be destroy or neutralize, but it can also be really nuanced and soft. So it could be empowering a cultural group or um, you might want to reassure.
Mm,
a local population, and these are really hard things to measure. It's really
mm,
easy to
mm.
measure the
Yeah,
destruction of a
yeah.
physical object. It's really hard to measure how empowered
Mm,
women are in society, or how reassured a demographic is
mm,
at the improving security situation. But you have to measure the effects you're trying to achieve. So commanders will talk about these effects. They'll use mission command. So they'll say to their subordinate commanders and organizations, these are the effects you need to achieve. You work out with the resources you've got how you're going to achieve them. That's your job, not mine.
mm,
But I'm going to measure the effect you have, not the performance that you have. And so measurement of performance is about counting things that you've done.
mm.
Measuring effect is about measuring the
Yeah,
effectiveness
get the
of
outcome.
the
Yeah.
things you've done. One is easier than the other.
Mm,
And so part of this challenge is getting organizations to not only invest in building their teams, but also to invest in measuring things that are difficult to measure.
yes. And that then I guess is where it's kind of comes back to how we need to join the dots. So it's no good having this person or this team, this department over here working on this bit of an organization, and that bit over there is kind of working on how we recognize performance and all that, performance reviews and so on, which tend to be quite separate or thought of as very separate. And actually, well, I guess this partly comes back to strategy and the whole kind of the bigger conversation around actually how it all fits together. And if you're looking at changing one thing, one part of an organization, it will be impacting on others and it will be impacted by others. So it's about kind of, yeah, helping people see the repercussions of what they're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that General Stan McChrystal, so the guy who said
Mm,
don't punish mistakes, one of the things he did when he took over from an organization called Special Operations Command was to take people from various bits of this organization. So the intelligence staff who are doing analysis, the what we call the door kickers, the trigger pullers who are abseiling out of helicopters and
mm,
doing really exciting things, the logisticians who are making sure there's enough fuel and ammunition and food, the admin department that are making sure people get paid, and
mm,
the welfare teams. And he took the best people from each of these different organizations and took them out of their comfort zones and put them into other bits of the organization. And initially, there was a lot of resistance to that
mm,
because you're taking all your A team players
mm,
out of your operations team or your intelligence staff or your
mm.
logistics team, and you're putting them into somewhere where they're not going to be that effective. But what it did over time was it created this sort of understanding of what other people across the organization are doing in support of the overall mission
Yeah.
and the challenges that they face and the
Mm,
difficulties that they have in communicating across the organization. And very, very quickly, what starts off being a really uncomfortable exercise leads to lots of light bulb moments where people say, ah, we always got really frustrated when you ask these stupid questions on a Friday afternoon.
yeah.
But now I see why you don't ask those until Friday, because you don't get this information till, you know,
Yeah.
Thursday evening, and it takes you 24 hours to process it. Or we always thought you were just doing that for the sake of it, but it turns out there's a whole load of other process behind it that this is really important and we hadn't recognized it. And suddenly you end up with teams now starting to not only pull information from other bits of the
Mm,
organization that they need, but
mm.
also push information out because they recognize other people are going to need it. And everybody starts to work towards the common goal.
Yeah.
And that's really, really important. But again, it means leaders taking capacity away from frontline operations
Mm,
now, so probably reducing efficiency
yeah.
in order to build growth.
And I think that's a really important point. I mean, the example you've just given about people sort of swapping roles in different teams and having a better understanding and of what each team's doing, I've seen practice where that happens, and you have those light bulb moments of what would make my life a lot easier, a lot more effective, is if I had this, and this information, but I don't get it. And then someone else in another team says, that's really easy. I just didn't know you needed it. So it's
Yeah.
kind of, you just think, because they haven't had those conversations. Um, so I think that example is really powerful about being able to join up and I guess create the space for people to kind of really reflect on their practice. So if people are going to think about having listened to what you said today, it's like actually I'm going to analyze what we're doing in terms of how strategic are we? Are we engaging in strategy? Are we spending our time in operations and tactics? Kind of how are we going about all that? Is there a kind of a simple-ish starting point that people can have the conversation with each other in their teams to work out where they're spending most of their time?
So I think we've covered a lot of ground,
Yeah.
and your listeners might feel a little bit overwhelmed with having to, do lots and lots of things. But I think the first thing is to recognize that strategy is about long-term goals for
Mm,
the organization
mm,
under those conditions of uncertainty. So the very first thing you need to do is to make sure that you know what those goals are.
mm,
They're very, very clear, and then they're clearly articulated to everybody in the organization. And
mhm,
when I say everybody in the organization, I don't mean heads of department, I mean everybody.
mm,
And the really famous example of this was NASA when they recalibrated for the moonshot mission given to them by President Kennedy.
mm,
It famously, the janitors that were cleaning the floors of the labs knew what the overall mission was and their part in it.
mm.
And something as mundane as cleaning the floors was actually vital because a lot of the equipment, if it got dust on it,
Exactly.
wouldn't have worked.
Yeah.
And so everybody then feels not only empowered and part of a greater
Mm,
purpose, but also recognizes where they can make small changes in what they do
mm,
to better the organization. So I think that's the first thing. If you have a common goal and everybody understands and
mm,
agrees with that goal, then you're in a really, really good starting place. Then you can start to look at things like, do I have the right command structure? Do I recognize the difference between what is strategic decision making, what is tactical decision making? Do I have the right access to information? Am I asking the right questions?
yeah.
But I
That's
think start with a common goal.
yeah. But that's a really good starting point because I think that's something that people can go and kind of deep dive into like yeah we have this goal but actually how much do people know it across the whole organization, could they tell you what our common goal is? And what I think is always really interesting, I'll ask questions to people on leadership teams about that and you can see them all looking down trying to remember what it's supposed to be so that it show themselves up. Like if you don't know it, how's anyone else supposed to know it?
Yeah, and I see this all the time, and I see conflation between the idea of a goal, a mission, and a vision, and they're
Mm,
different things again. So, a goal is something that is achievable.
hmm.
It can output, whereas a mission is a purpose. It's what you're for, and a vision is the story you tell, the narrative you tell on how it would look if it was all done perfectly. So they are different, and quite often I see those things conflated. And like you said, I quite often see organisations where you ask what their goals are, and they've either got 12, which is far too many,
Yeah,
or there's only one or two, but there's like four paragraphs they're supposed to have remembered. And you've got to keep it really simple.
yeah,
What is it you are doing, and how are you intending to do it?
yeah. So if organizations listen to this thinking, wow, this all sounds like quite hard work, or we're just going to keep pottering along in the way that we are currently, what's the impact of that? So, in terms of if people don't start thinking about differentiating between strategy and tactics and operations and so on, and they continue to do their kind of mishmash or just focusing on what the area that they are in currently, what is that okay? I mean, potentially
Yeah.
not, but I'm just wondering for them, what's going to be the motivation for them to change?
if you are in an organization that is facing change, then if you just continue to do what you're doing, then you might get better at doing what you're doing, but
Mm.
what you're doing will become less and less relevant. And I talk about this in terms of accuracy and precision. You can be precisely inaccurate.
Mm.
If the target you're aiming at is moving and
Mm.
you are not moving with it, then you can be as good as you like at what it is you do. But if what you do is no longer relevant, then you are precisely inaccurate. And this is, the famous examples of Kodak or Nokia or, these are all companies that honed their skills, were world leaders, but they were world leaders in something that was no longer relevant. So I think if you don't look at change, if you don't look at growth, if you don't look at allowing people on the edges of your organization who have access to new information to be innovative, to have creative ideas, then there's a real risk that you're going to be irrelevant, or you're going to realize just in time and it's going to be a hell of a lot more painful in shifting to get to where you need to be.
And then you have those panic moments of just complete overwhelm. It's like this thing's happening. We suddenly realize we're about to be extinct because everyone else has moved.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, and there will always be those sort of black swan events and those shock events that happen, that did take you by surprise.
Mm.
COVID was a great example of that.
Mm.
But even then, organizations that have built resilience, organizations that have a strategic goal, that understand their purpose really, really well, that have built psychological safety and have an organizational culture that is full of mutual trust, that is full of accepting that things will go wrong
Mm.
without having a blame culture. They did really, really well. They adapted. So it's not about, and when I did intelligence work, it's not about predicting the future. You're
Mm.
not a soothsayer. The world is unpredictable. There is lots of things that are happening. It's about understanding trends and thinking about the what could happen, the what ifs,
Mm.
and making sense of what you know now to best prepare yourself. And then as new information comes to light and you can actively go and find it, or
Mm.
sometimes it just falls in your lap, you're then in a far better position to make the right decisions and head on that strategic journey towards
Mm.
that goal.
And even that question, what could happen, I think is a great one. I'm always trying to get people to revamp their team meetings. Like, let's just get off the kind of traditional agenda you have and think about some stuff that might be more interesting to engage with and actually make a real difference. That kind of what could change, or what could be the next good idea, or what could go wrong with this, and actually creating a space goes back right to the start of, in terms of creating time, creating space to predict and plan and just put on, black hat thinking in terms of, okay, this is the stuff that potentially is going to go wrong in the future. And just trying to think about, okay, so have these kind of what might seem way off ideas. If people suggest something like COVID, people have gone, that will never happen. But come up with these scenarios and then think, okay, if that were to happen, how would we respond? And I guess the more the kind of variety of scenarios people can come up with, you have more confidence in your ability to respond, and that builds resilience.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that we did in the military that I now talk about and try and get organizations to do is to war game.
Yes.
And literally in the military, that is, pushing little counters around, representing tactical units, and somebody plays the enemy and says, well,
Mm.
what would the enemy do? And they try and get into the mindset of what the enemy is trying to achieve, how they fight, all their tactics. You can do exactly the same in a corporate environment, or it doesn't matter. You can do it in any context where there is complexity.
Mm.
And you can start to red team all the assumptions you've made in your planning. You can look at the what if scenarios, the most likely, the most dangerous, the worst case scenarios, and you can have contingency plans. And you say, if this happens, then these will be the bits of information that are indicators that it's going to happen, and we will need to follow this procedure. We'll, convene an emergency meeting or whatever it is. And you can start to then get comfortable with what change is going to look like. And I was working with an organization a few years ago where one of the challenges they had was they ran a chain of cafes. It wasn't the only thing they did, but one of the challenges they had were this idea of the customer is always right, customer satisfaction and um, trying to build customer relations so you've got loyalty and brand loyalty with people making decisions that were costing the organization lots and lots of money.
Mm,
And the reality was that they'd overcomplicated the problem. They created a whole load of process that were, you're only allowed to allocate resources up to a certain value. You're only allowed to refund up to this amount, and if it's more than this, you have to get a line manager. And the reality was what they actually needed to do was to look at the challenges that baristas and frontline staff had on a daily basis, and then come up with a whole series of guiding principles
mm,
that say, in these kind of situations, this is what you're empowered to do.
mm,
And then use your judgment, and you will never be wrong. We will never punish you. If you make mistakes, we will learn from them. Um, and overnight, this massive problem they had changed. And then a few months later, there was a whole load of case studies of things that had gone wrong. And because they'd implemented this judgment approach, in almost every case, what had started as a mistake, something has gone wrong, an order's been done incorrectly or been forgotten about, or whatever, ended up being an opportunity to build customer loyalty.
mm.
Because it's not the mistake that matters, it's the way you deal with it.
Exactly.
And this company had focused on the wrong things, and really simply by running a war game, and I called it a war game,
Yeah.
but it was basically just creating a load of fictitious scenarios.
Yeah.
Some of them were really, extreme and elaborate and are
Yeah.
likely never to happen. But it got people thinking about how much they would empower a local branch manager, how much
Mm,
they would empower the barista. Where does empowering a decision butt up against compliance and health and safety, and all of those kind of conversations that were really, really useful to have.
mm.
And what it then enabled them to do is when they were faced with real world situations, they were far more comfortable in dealing with them and they did it really well.
Brilliant. Love that. I could honestly keep talking to you for another hour, but we can't. So I'm just thinking about what I normally ask my guests is to think about a piece of advice, a takeaway that they'd want listeners to leave with in terms of doing something that's different. And I have a feeling that yours might be around that step one about goals. Am I right? Or is there something else you'd be saying, take this away?
Yeah, I think you are right. I think unless you have coherence in what you're trying to achieve with an organization, then everything else is kind of noise. I mean, until you've sorted out what you're for,
Mm,
what you are trying to achieve. And when I talk about, strategy over the long term, that doesn't have to be 10 years out. That could be 12 months out. It could be a month out. It doesn't matter. The long term is contextual. What's important is that there is a clear vision on how you're going to get there, but also a very, very clear understanding across the organization that what you're talking about now as the plan
mm,
isn't going to be what actually happens. That
mm,
plan will never meet reality. And so people are not disappointed when things
mm,
don't go to plan.
mm.
And actually, it creates opportunities and people get excited by new opportunities. So there's absolutely a focus on purpose, vision, goals, and communication across the organization. And once you've got that in place, then you can start to worry about whether you're getting your tactics or your strategy confused.
Yeah. Sounds good. And I would urge listeners to this to check out your podcast that you have with Chris Kitchener. Is that right? Um, called Battling with Business. We'll make sure there's a link to that in the show notes because you talk about all this kind of stuff in more detail, and I've listened to a few of the episodes, and it's fascinating. So I'd urge people to go there. Gareth, thank you so very much for joining me today and sharing your insight. It's brilliant hearing about your experience and your knowledge of how you can translate these skills and bring all these into business and the difference it can make. And I think you've brilliantly outlined how to think about those things and the why. You know, I think that's the really important bit about why am I going to make my life more complicated. Actually, that last case example of the coffee shops actually simplifies rather than having to learn a kind of load of different reactions. It's like just think about how you judge and how you behave and so I think that was absolutely brilliant. I love that. Thank you so very much for joining me.
Well, thank you for having me.
Pleasure. What have you taken from that conversation to think about or do differently? How has that inspired you to develop practice to bring out the best in people, including yourself? This podcast gets more listeners when people like you give a thumbs up on Apple or wherever you listen, and especially if you leave a short review. So please help be part of the movement towards creating workplaces that really provide the best experience for their people. And do reach out to me directly to discuss your challenges at work and ideas for development. If we're not already acquainted on LinkedIn, let's connect. All the links you need are in the show notes. And if you join the club, you'll be the first to hear about relevant updates and free downloadable resources that are part of developing practice and performance. Thanks for joining me today.